All right, so Isaiah 24. Here, Isaiah describes the gospel reaching the ends of the earth before the devastating wrath of God against the wicked at Israel's final deliverance. It's very interesting what he's going to talk about in this chapter. Now, similar to Isaiah 13, Isaiah receives a vision of God's final judgment to remove sinners from the earth, which John the Apostle would come to characterize as the bowl judgments. There's no escaping Isaiah's depiction of mass casualties. There's no escaping Isaiah's depiction of mass casualties of the righteous and unrighteous before the Messianic age begins, but not without the promise of resurrection hope for the righteous. We're going to go ahead and jump in. Well, let me just give you the quick cross-reference. Remember this section of Isaiah 13. I'm not going to pull that up on the screen, but it's in the notes. I'm just going to read it to you real quick. He says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy sinners from it." And he goes on and he gives kind of descriptions of these final wrath judgments. Psalm 104, similarly, the psalmist says, "Let sinners be consumed from the earth and let the wicked be no more." And in context of Psalm 104 is talking about so that restoration can take place, so that the earth can be renewed and rejuvenated and completely done away with every consequence of sin that entered creation at the Garden of Eden. And then Isaiah 10, Isaiah describes this judgment as well. He says there's destruction that's decreed, but it's overflowing with righteousness. There is an inherent righteousness in these decrees that you don't want to lose sight of as you're diving into what are some wrath judgments that can be very discouraging and disheartening, but there is a righteous outcome on the other side of them that Isaiah is going to get more into in these chapters. So let's get into it. "Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants." Now, this is very similar to chapter 13, some things that we can look at where there's wrath, there's desolation, there's emptying. God's judgment will be universal in its scope without any regard for status or authority. Because look, it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the slave, so with the master. There's this universal application, which you can really see there in verse 2 and verse 3. "The earth will be utterly empty and utterly plundered. The Lord has spoken this word." Now, commentators agree that verse 3 should be read more approximately, "The earth will surely be laid waste and plundered," rather than the idea of complete emptiness, like void of any life. That's not really that'd be a really inconsistent interpretation, because Isaiah talks a lot about life and survivors and restoration of life, even on the earth after these wrath judgments. And so even when it comes to the translation of the language itself, commentators argue it's not that the earth is completely emptied and reset, but it's that there's a absolute level of just devastation and plundering and desolation, where it's like nothing is left that would be undesolate or whatever. It's very thorough. The earth is not going to be absolutely empty, and of course Isaiah would contradict himself if he said it was going to be absolutely empty in the ultimate sense, because he says in Isaiah 4, "All those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem after these judgments, will be called holy, and everyone whose name has been recorded, everybody who's alive will be recorded for life in Jerusalem." In verses 4 through 6, "The earth mourns and withers. The world languishes and withers, and the highest people of the earth languish. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws and violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant." So rather than describe the curses as isolated judgments or plagues, Isaiah describes the curses of the land as the culmination of human transgression during the rebellion and tribulation that couple with the bowl judgments. They've transgressed, they've broken the covenant, and so the curses of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, when the covenant is broken and the land is defiled, all of that is allowed to culminate in that generation before Jesus returns, and that's really the desolation is the reaction of creation to the land being defiled. It's more than just God's judgment as plagues from heaven, but it's the response of the earth suffering under defilement in a defiled state. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer their guilt. It's not just God's punishment, but it's our guilt. It's the consequences of our actions. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left. Now that's actually really important. I mean, what does it look like for the earth to be scorched? Does that have to do with things like climate change that might have some real heightened consequences in a particular generation where certain things happen that might trigger some climate events? You would think, probably so. But there's more than that too. I think there's God's judgment intermingled with that, which Isaiah is going to get into. But it's very interesting to look at that and think, wow, what all is Isaiah really referring to there? And where are the cross references to that? Maybe in Micah and Amos and Hosea and some contemporary prophets who were just with him. Anyway, that's more we can get into in the discussion group. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. That's what makes this so much fun. Verses 7 through 11, the merriment of the rebellion will be long forgotten, and all of humanity's coping strategies to deaden their senses cannot relieve the terror of God's final judgment. God afflicts the wicked with unrelievable dread. The wine mourns, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh. The mirth of the tambourines is stilled. The noise of jubilant has ceased. The mirth of the lyre has stilled. Now it's always very purposeful why Isaiah references the music of the rebellion. The music of the rebellion has a strong influence on the inhabitants of the earth, and there's a reason why Isaiah repeatedly highlights that. And we will come back to that more, but that music actually has an influence, and there's actually a meaningful purpose of silencing that music so that the inhabitants of the earth, and Israel and specifically, can awaken, can come out of the stupor of what this music lulls them into. It's very deceptive. So no more do they drink wine with singing. Strong drink while they sing, that strong drink becomes bitter to those who drink it. The wasted city is broken down. The wasted city, that's interesting. I don't know. Isaiah talks a lot about a specific city being specifically wasted. But it could be more than that. But here at least we know there's a reference to a city being wasted and broken down. Every house is shut up so that none can enter. There's a specifically desolated city, which again, we've looked at in some, say, Isaiah 21, Isaiah 13. There's an outcry in the streets. For lack of wine, all joy has grown dark. The gladness of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city, and the gates are battered into ruins. Now, specifically, Isaiah's hinting, the mention of plunder from verse 3 as well. God's final judgment sends the earth into chaotic conflict and anarchy, even the gates being battered into ruins. For thus it shall be in the midst of the earth among the nations, as when the olive tree is beaten, at the gleaning when the grape harvesting is done. Now, we've talked about this before. The imagery of the vine being seized and shaken so that the grapes will fall off. And that's part of the function of God's judgments in that day. We'll come back to that, though. We've talked about that too in previous weeks. They lift up their voices. They sing for joy over the majesty of the Lord. Shout from the west. Therefore, in the east, give glory to the Lord. Now, here in verses 14 to 16, obviously there's a pivot. That's why I've colored it differently in my highlights here, because you've got this desolation, this wrath, yikes. And then suddenly, what is this? What is Isaiah seeing here? And commentators are unsure precisely what to do with this sudden depiction of praise enveloping the earth. So there's two suggestions that stand out as likely solutions. Isaiah sees the resulting global worship of God after God's judgments are complete. This could be during the Messianic age. Or Isaiah sees the proclamation of the gospel reaching the ends of the earth before the final judgment. It's almost like Isaiah is seeing a little parenthetical section where there's a glimmer of hope of what has actually been accomplished for good before these judgments are fully released, which is interesting. Both suggestions have biblical merit. which doesn't leave us with a lot of need to have to choose before them. Actually, both of those interpretations can be true and not mutually exclusive. Really, this vision may be what Jesus is referencing when he describes the gospel reaching the ends of the earth before a particular event, which he talks about in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. In Mark 13, verse 10, let me see if I can pull this up. I might as well. It's in the notes, but this is one we're going to look at later, and I would like to pull it up so you can see it. Mark 13, 10. There it is. Let me highlight it, make it a little bit easier to see. Of course, verses in red, it's like, how well can I truly highlight them? Did that work? And I made it Christmassy. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations. Gosh, that highlight is dreadful. You're making me have to change it. If you're watching the video, sorry for getting you all through this. Okay, there we go. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations. And in context, he's talking about signs of the end of the age. That's what this whole section is about, and something that we're going to talk about in a later week. Now, the same thing gets mentioned in Matthew 24. It's a parallel passage by a different author, 24:14. This is also in the notes. And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And what does Jesus talk about next? Well, it's the same thing that Isaiah is about to mention here in chapter 24. So let's get back to Isaiah. Again, he sees the gospel going to the ends of the earth. They lift up their voices, they sing for joy. It's not necessarily that the whole earth, that all the population of the earth are involved in this, but that the praise is reaching the furthest reaches of the earth, that there are at least members of every population who are participating in this. Not that all the members of every population are. If you get my meaning. They lift up their voices, they sing for joy over the majesty of the Lord. They shout from the west, therefore in the east give glory to the Lord. In the coastlands of the sea give glory to the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. From the ends of the earth, again, specifically, where the Great Commission is being talked about here. From the ends of the earth, we hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. Now, what an interesting place to put a description of the fulfillment of the Great Commission in the middle of depictions of God's judgment at the end of the age. Jesus did go out of his way to explain that the scenarios, the circumstances of that final generation of the end of the age are uniquely designed to propel the gospel to every nation, tribe, and tongue. That's purposeful in the design of the unfolding of the end of the age. Now here, Isaiah is seeing the same thing. You might not be realizing it with the same clarity that Jesus described it, but it's here. It's being talked about. There's the context very clearly of eschatological wrath, but there is the gospel going to the ends of the earth. We hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. But it's not just that. Isaiah sees the context. He sees what happens related to the gospel going to the ends of the earth. And it's the same thing that Jesus comes to reference in Mark 13 and 24. It's the betrayer. It's that moment of betrayal that we looked at from Isaiah 21 just last week. Go back, look at Isaiah 21, because he says it's very, very important. This moment of betrayal that the Antichrist commits that initiates a season shift, a change in the periods of the end of the age, the unfolding of God's redemptive plan. And that's where he's at here with verse 16. He sees the gospel going to the ends of the earth, but he says, but I say, I waste away. I waste away. Woe is me. That grief from chapter 21 has hit him again. For the traitors have betrayed. It's the same thing from chapter 21. The Antichrist betrayal of Babylon. The Antichrist unmasking himself and going on global conquest, which we looked at in verse 10 and verse 13. For traitors have betrayed. With betrayal, the traitors have betrayed. Seeing that moment. And it's a grievous moment. And that's what Jesus talks about here in Matthew 24 and in Mark 13. He refers to it as the abomination of desolation. Now, the reason why Jesus is using that terminology, but Isaiah does not, is because Daniel hasn't happened yet. Jesus is referencing prophecies from Daniel, where Daniel labels it an act of abomination that makes the world desolate. And that's what Isaiah is seeing here, but it's just not using that language. That was Daniel's language. which Jesus came to later reference. Now you kind of get, hopefully, the picture. We're going to get to Daniel very soon, actually, not very long. After we go through, if we're going to finish Isaiah, we're going to go through probably Nahum and Habakkuk and, let's see, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. Yeah, they're going to be all kind of together. So what happens when the betrayer betrays? When the destroyer destroys? What's going to happen to the earth? Well, that is the initiation of what most commentators and what Jesus would later call the Great Tribulation, the final tribulation period. Nobody yet in biblical prophecy that we've come to at this point has given that a time frame, like a specific start and finish or length, but they have listed it as a part of the sequence, that there's the rebellion, there's the tribulation, and then there's the deliverance. And so he's seeing the point, the moment, that the act of betrayal that initiates the Great Tribulation. It's a woe to Isaiah, and he says, "Terror and the pit of the snare are upon you, O inhabitants of the earth." When that great tribulation begins, it is the snare of the Lord that entraps the earth. Where, as Amos said in Amos chapter 8, Amos said, "This is the time that's ripe for harvest. The harvest is here to harvest the deeds of the earth, the righteous and the wicked, and to deal with wickedness." So terror and the pit of the snare are upon you, O inhabitants of the earth. He who flees at the sound of the terror shall fall in the pit, and he who climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. Again, this is almost kind of interesting. Again, the point of you're not going to be able to escape it, but it's almost going back to language that we looked at back in chapter 13 that was pretty gruesome in terms of the way that the Lord used wicked nations and wicked people to inflict judgment that could not be escaped. And it's dreadful. But that's the same kind of thing that's in view here at the second half of chapter 24. Isaiah describes mighty earthquakes shaking the earth, destruction that's so comprehensive that there's no hope of rebuilding from the old. The earth staggers like a drunken man. It sways like a hut. The transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls and it will not rise again. Meaning that old system cannot come back. Like the old way that we used to do society is not going to work again. It's going to have to be something rebuilt. On that day, the Lord will punish even the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of the earth on the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. Interestingly, there's this pit imprisonment that Isaiah sees. Now, John the Apostle in Revelation will go into much more detail about that pit, but Isaiah sees it here. At the end of the tribulation, there's this gathering of these prisoners into a pit. Well, I'm not going to get into all of what John is going to reveal about that in the book of Revelation, but we definitely see Psalm 82 is being mentioned here, a couple other places. We'll probably get into that again, but in Psalm 82, God sits in judgment, not just of the wicked of earth, but of the hosts of heaven who have sided with the devil and the Antichrist. They're gathered together and imprisoned. They'll be shut up in a prison. After many days, they will be punished. Interesting. So there's a prison and imprisoning, and then there's a period of many days. There's some kind of period in there, which is the Messianic age before their final punishment. Again, Daniel and John the Apostle in the book of Revelation are going to get a lot more into what is in that period of many days. What's in that really is the Messianic age. And John, I think, is really the only one who gives us a clear, this is how many days that Messianic age is going to be before the final punishment. Well, we'll have to wait to get into that later. It's not that important how many the days are. It's just that you know that there are days in between, and that's the Messianic age, where Satan's influence has been removed from the earth, and the Messiah rules, and there's this period of prosperity and covenant fulfillment. And then look, the moon will be confounded, and the sun will be ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns. This is the beginning of what I said, the Messianic age, on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. Oh, I love that he just throws that in there. Isaiah continues with this description of the Messianic reign from Jerusalem during the Messianic age, which is the ultimate hope. This is the ultimate hope of all of this stuff that's going to happen. You got to keep the hope in view that there's a redemptive outcome and covenant fulfillment that's to be had when this is over. Well, he's going to continue describing what that looks like into chapter 25.